Hey guys, this is Justin. Hello and welcome to another video. So the content remains in your hands, as today we will continue to look at some of your #AskEck questions. If you've got a video you'd like to pitch to me, feel free to do so. We might do a couple today, we'll see how the length works out, but I love this question by Jacob Gaming, who says, why was the Dreadnought Heavy Cruiser in Star Wars Rebels built for one scene but then never did anything? I would love to know your opinion on this. And yes, the Dreadnought Class Heavy Cruiser does appear in one scene of Star Wars Rebels. It's the second to last episode of the final season. And honestly, this got me way more excited than it should have, as did the reference to Admiral Pelion in the series finale. I actually did a video on that way back in the day. I started YouTube in 2017. The Rebels finale was happening in early 2018. I wasn't really in my groove yet, but I wish I had been doing full episode breakdowns because it's something that deserved more attention. What's notable, of course, is that the Dreadnought Class Heavy Cruiser, which the behind the scenes guide for Rebels called the Imperial Support Vessel, looked almost identical to its Star Wars Legends counterpart. The engines are a bit different. That's some small artistic licensing. Honestly, they looked modernized, but I know a lot of you are wondering, why should I care about this random boring ass ship? Well, the Dreadnought Class Heavy Cruiser is one of the mainstays of Star Wars Legends. It appeared all the way back in the original Star Wars Imperial sourcebook in the late 80s as one of the Imperial ships not featured in the films. Then it rose to increased prominence in the Thrawn trilogy, where it was described as an out-of-date vessel, which was used primarily during the Old Republic era and into the Clone Wars. Now keep in mind, back when Timothy Zahn was writing the Thrawn trilogy, he had no idea what the Clone Wars was or how the timeline really worked out, but the story from the trilogy is that Grand Admiral Thrawn captured a large portion of the Dark Force, which was an entire fleet of what were called Katana-class dreadnoughts, upgraded dreadnoughts which were supposed to be more automated and more efficient. Why the dreadnought is important, however, is because even after the prequels were established, in the expanded universe, the dreadnought remained a product of the Old Republic and served in the Clone Wars. A lot of what the Bantam era of publishing said about the Clone Wars, the technology, the ships, even the history of that era was discarded, but the Dreadnought Class Heavy Cruiser remained an important aspect. Although it never did feature in any of the films or the Clone Wars TV show, it was frequently mentioned in Clone Wars content. Even the Revenge of the Sith novelization, we hear about Dreadnought Class Heavy Cruisers at the Battle of Coruscant, and even in the New Republic era, it was honestly one of the most iconic EU first vehicles ever created, which is really cool. And the lore is nice as well. It's a bulky, slow, out-of-date vessel which still finds some use because of its armor and its ubiquity. Plus, dreadnoughts could also be heavily customized, which, if you're talking about the tabletop scene or even the novel scene, adds a lot of options in terms of storytelling. That's why I think it's really cool that Star Wars Rebels acknowledged the dreadnought. It threw it directly into Imperial fleets. I know at one point ships like the dreadnought were considered for Star Wars squadrons, for example, but yeah, it's disappointing that we haven't seen more on-screen appearances. We've seen it in the comics, but I mean, they had an opportunity to add it in the Clone Wars Season 7. They could have added it in Tales of the Empire or Tales of the Jedi. They never did, and I am sort of left wondering why, and I can't think of one good reason. But it's important because it did open the door for these to be further codified in Star Wars Legends, and for that, at least, I do appreciate it. I wonder whether Ahsoka could reintroduce the Dreadnought as a tool of Grand Admiral Thrawn, although at this point that seems to be fairly unlikely. I do understand I'm sort of dancing around the question here, but in honesty, we don't have really a good answer for why it hasn't made the transition to other animated or live action mediums, but it is good to know that they at least have the asset ready, which I do think is important. And it's also possible because of that fact that the Dreadnought has been snuck into the Bad Batch or other shows. All right, we are going to do two more quick questions. Nerd in the Attic Productions asks, could you do a video explaining the difference between modified New Republic Star Destroyers like the Anakin Solo and stock ISD-2s? And honestly, this is something that's not covered a ton in the novels. In fact, we don't even know whether the Anakin Solo, the Mon Mothma, the Elagos Akla, etc. were newly constructed Imperial Star Destroyers or heavily modified variants recovered from the Empire. An important aspect of some of these ships like the Mon Mothma is that it had interdiction capabilities without the obvious interdictor bulbs. In terms of the Mon Mothma, I think we first learn about that in the Dark Nest trilogy when the ship has turned against Han and Leia, at least if my memory's serving me correctly. So that's sort of a tactical bonus, and that's kind of how I see these ISDs generally. The New Republic had many Star Destroyers at this point, and you have these upgraded ships which aren't immediately identifiable as having greater abilities, and you can use that to surprise the enemy. The most prominent of the unique ISDs is definitely the Anakin Solo, and again, we don't hear a whole lot about what makes it different exactly. The weaponry would have all been upgraded. One thing I hear people talk about in reference to the Anakin Solo is longer range turbo lasers, and I think that probably just comes from the wiki article and a couple of lines from like the Battle of Kashyyyk. But the Anakin Solo certainly was upgraded. It certainly did have more powerful, longer range weapons, and it also had, to the Solo family at least, a very offensive name. Having a Star Destroyer named after your dead kid is not something most families are looking for, and that offensiveness is also true when it comes to Mon Mothma, obviously the leader of the rebellion, and Elagos Akla probably more than all, given that he was a pacifist who would have hated warships. Alright, so this final question is from Rancid Water, and it's one that I think in the future will probably get a dedicated video. He asks whether I could talk about how shields work. How can ships shoot through their own shield but block others? How planetary shields work, etc. So in Star Wars, shields have both an energy component and a matter blocking component. With some exceptions, you should not be able to shoot through your own shield at enemies, although yes, it is something that does happen in the lore. Most starships should also have shields which prevent both missiles and turbo lasers. You shouldn't be able to fly through an enemy shield either and land on the ship itself, but it is something which frequently happens for the point of plot convenience. And honestly, to the reader, these topics and these lore specifics aren't really discussed. You can only figure this out by going to secondary material. I think that has to do a little bit with the sort of careless nature that Star Wars often handles space battles with, but it's also just the reality of what it's like. Certain books do this well. The X-Wing series, for example, always on with how it treats shielding versus missiles and lasers. Other times, not as great. But this isn't the only case where Star Wars hasn't really figured out how its own technology works. If we do a full video, I'll break down a bunch of examples, but another good one is hyperspace communications. In Star Wars Legends, there are various occasions where we are told that communicating with other ships or planets in hyperspace is impossible, yet at times when the plot requires it, it's easily done, and Star Wars canon has taken that approach as well. We see in The Last Jedi, I believe, for example, communication in hyperspace is easy, yet past sources say the opposite. The same plot inconsistencies exist for pretty much anything involving hyperspace travel, like how hyperspace routes work on a fundamental level, how dangerous it is to travel uncharted space, even where you can jump from hyperspace. Can you do it within a planet's atmosphere or not? Interdictors also inconsistent. Is an interdiction field, or really any sort of mass shadow, something that physically pulls you out of hyperspace, or can you bypass safety limits on your computer to jump? These have went both ways, and again, it adds to the overall effect that as a reader or a watcher, you can't necessarily predict how something is going to happen, and then when it does, it sometimes feels like the story and the technology was written around the specific plot the writer is trying to fulfill rather than the other way around. But that's just my opinion. Let me know yours, of course, down below. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you've got future questions, leave them with the hashtag AskEck, and I'll try to get to them when I can. Leave a like, subscribe, and until next time, I'll see you soon. May the Force be with you.